Oracle of the Forgotten. The Humans. Rise Before the Fall, Part 3. Aelynn woke from a dream that seemed to haunt her senses. Everything about her waking world was the same. She knew in her dream that she was her other self, the one she kept mostly hidden from the mortal world, Idrissa. When had she last used that identity? Even in traveling, she'd not used the name in some time. She had tried to let it fade. It allowed her a new life, mostly free from her veil-seen past. Still, maybe there was a reason it came back. She could barely remember some lifetimes as Idrissa. She knew one had ended quite suddenly, but glancing back, she just couldn't quite grasp it. She had hoped to beat the swordsman in getting up this morning, but she went to find her breakfast and he was there for a drink. The woman half growled at one of the locals who was walking towards him and then moved to sit near him. Her constant challenging of the women in the area was almost amusing to him. It wasn't as if she were his partner or anything of the sort, but her loyalty seemed to include a strange sense of protectiveness, or perhaps it was a mild obsession. The human didn't fully care. It was refreshing to see someone even bothering to take notice of him. The last time it had been a redhead. She was fun, but he shook his head and muttered into his drink and then closed his eyes. No, that one was not a memory he wanted either. Those who traveled with him kept dying. Better not to entertain such things if this one decided to try and drag him into the same kind of relationship. Still, she was so strange to him. Familiar, yet seemed to not recall anything about him. He couldn't place it himself. Normally, if the energies were off, he would have been warned. In fact, he knew who to ask when the time came if he needed to do so. If you have time. Aelynn had been speaking. He hadn't even noticed until that phrase hit him. It took him a bit of thinking to realize she was talking to him specifically. I have no major plans. He was waiting. He didn't like waiting, but it was what it was. You weren't listening. What if I'd asked for something other than to train together? Her eyes were now locked on him, and he realized he hadn't really cared. She probably could have asked him anything. It wasn't like he'd committed to it. It's not really the best idea. You'll end up injured, and I will not hold back. Still, he was curious. He hadn't seen her fighting much. If anything, she seemed to find a way around it or to minimize it when she had to. You may be injured as well. It could be interesting. She paused a moment, then offered some kind of half-dangerous smirk that made him wonder about her slightly. That expression seemed almost too familiar. Was it an elvish thing? He honestly couldn't remember. It felt like ages since he'd interacted with any elf, including the most recent one. It wouldn't be a good thing, though, if she went into the places he was about to travel without the ability. He shook his head and chuckled slightly. If you think you can, I welcome it. He shifted, then stretched a moment before reaching to set his cup down. She was bold, but was she capable? Still, it seemed she wanted to follow. This time he could test her first. He was still half hoping that she would leave. Most never survived long enough around him in the first place. They agreed to meet towards the center of the village in the afternoon. He honestly had no intention of keeping her from being harmed. The pure confidence of her reply was making him question if she had any idea at all what she was getting into. Still, there was so much to be done across the day. He asked her to meet with him later. The human decided to scout the area himself to look for some answers. Specifically, anything he could find about the region that might lead him to what his actual goals were. Aelynn took some time to travel the village. In her current form, very few recognized her, but she had run into one or two who knew her alternate identity, the redhead that was called Idrissa. It wasn't a thing she wished to discuss with anyone, and even less to talk to the human about. Still, knowing that there were those who recognized her, she decided she may well have to address her own past sooner rather than later, if they weren't out of the village before someone else brought it up. Little did she know, as the human had been making his rounds, he was listening to random conversations, only so far as to see if they mentioned anything useful. What he heard, though, had sent a strange sensation through him. Idrissa, a name he hadn't heard in some time. Certainly they were mistaken. He was there when she was killed, but his battle made him continue forward despite that. Yet these two insisted that she had returned to their village again, and were afraid of what she might do this time. A part of him wanted to ask these strangers about this. The two had traveled together, and she'd been the last one he'd allowed to be close enough to be intimate with him for any period of time. If anything, he wondered why this village would have any knowledge of her at all. Another part couldn't afford the distraction. He'd seen the angel tear her apart. The wounds to her stomach had festered, exploding through her body to leave a hole through much of what had been her torso. He shook his head. It couldn't be anyway, and yet, why now? Why when he could hear it? An all too familiar voice filled his mind. Many faces, one soul. It fell silent, despite his demands for more answers. This old man was sometimes a cryptic ass and an absolute annoyance, yet he was never wrong. Arden would have to think on that later. He had things to do. As he traveled through the city, he found a shop selling books, potions, and magic spells. He figured it was a safe enough place to get supplies, assuming the woman running it wasn't as much of a problem as some of the rest of the village. The fact that he stepped into the room at the same time as Aelynn was purchasing her own items was almost too frustratingly coincidental for his liking. Was it even a coincidence at this point? Is this girl everywhere? A part of him wondered if it wasn't a trick by his enemies, sending yet another warrior woman to distract him from his goals. Still, she hadn't put the same effort into it that so many others had. A little light flirting at times, but it could have been passed off as merely being anxious. She'd been purchasing a few scrolls, a potion or two, nothing unusual, until he heard something he wasn't expecting. You should stay away from here, Driss. They'll figure out who you are. The woman at the counter was addressing Aelynn. He often called her by the human version of her surname. He wondered if this woman had mispronounced Theris. It was something he didn't have time to really consider, as the attention rather quickly turned on him again. Aelynn dismissed herself after saying a few words to the shopkeep, and then said nothing to the human nearby. After all, it wouldn't matter. She had no memories of her travels with him prior to this, nor did she expect any man to know her alternate life that she often lived. Her transformation between the two had nearly always been in private, or those who witnessed them had very rarely survived. As she passed through the doors, she felt the strange energy again. A sharp, sudden flux of light energy flowed through her body. It wasn't normal for her. It seemed to have a trigger, but she could never place it. Maybe another traveler? Maybe something more than that. Her mind was only replying with echoes. Hardly helpful. That was the moment Arden glanced back in her direction. He could sense it, see her lingering at a moment or two near the door. Angelic energies that felt nothing like the woman who had followed him here. It was something he would need to know more about, but there was more important matters at hand. After all, he would be meeting with her later for some practice. There, he could finally test whatever it was about her that was nipping at his mind, maybe even get to the bottom of why she was so interested in following him. The woman at the counter seemed confused at first when she noticed the man in her shop. In the end, though, she was more a librarian than a man-hater. When he began to ask about forbidden knowledge and things that no one should know, she genuinely smiled. She was an older lady, aged even beyond her years from too many years of experimenting with magics. She reached a hand for a nearby book with the broadest grin before looking over the pages. Then she quickly excused herself before returning with a few items. A handful of scrolls she felt would be useful and 2 potions. The first she said never to use, only to keep with him, and the second she said was the root of the healing solution he would need to survive the battles if he went to where it sounded like he would soon go. To his surprise, her prices were fair, unlike many of the women who seemed to run these shops here. If anything, it won a brief but genuine half-smile from the mortal. He paid for his goods and stepped out of the shop again. It wasn't too much later the two met up again, although this time it was a little more intentional for Aelynn. She wanted to see him a moment. She was hoping to ask him something and to test something. This energy within her. She was starting to suspect it somehow connected her to Arden, but she wasn't sure how to ask. Seeing that he looked to have a lot on his mind, she decided to let it rest for a little. Still, even as he approached her, he didn't speak. It wasn't long before his silence began to get to her again. You were after information. I studied quite a lot when I was younger. Maybe I have something useful tucked away? It was half a question and half a suggestion. She knew a lot about the Vale scene and the women here. Her knowledge of the region itself was a little limited to the times she'd been brought here with her leader to visit the Oracle. Depends on what you have to offer. If anything, he felt she was far younger than he was, and probably just trying to share whatever her wisdom be that she may have. If she had anything, it might be worthwhile. Still, he wasn't in the mood to waste time. He was more than irritated that the Oracle was still making him wait. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was to be an issue. I haven't seen you draw your blades since we met. Hope that edge won't dull. He remembered her challenge earlier. If anything, it would pass the time, but he honestly half hoped a good beating would convince her to do something else with her time. They will all die around you. That was not the voice he usually heard. It was a mocking echo of an old memory that hadn't proven to be wrong in the past. I only use it when I have to. If you want to see how well I can use it, there is a training ground. There are also the remains of many temples not far to the east. She was now just showing off a little. Her knowledge of the region was probably only slightly better than his. She was drawn towards those ruins, though, as if something inside of her was whispering, pulling her to them. It made her feel uneasy, but she only heard rumors of that place. There may not be anything useful there. It might be better to wait until we both have our armor, though. She paused a moment, then looked him over. Her mind began wandering a bit, but that only brought a slight blush to her cheeks, so she turned towards the training ground to hide it. You're afraid not to use armor? Having no armor sharpens your senses, your intuition. If you're afraid, then you shouldn't even bother hauling it around with you. He wanted her to understand. He had spent many ages with a sword. He didn't need or even bother with having armor. This time he had chosen it due to where he was going and to stop others from attempting to aid him. A sort of cold bitterness washed over him. The young ones like this, always afraid, carrying their weapons and barely using them. relying on their armor and tricks. It all had a place, but it wasn't what would be the deciding factor in the end. I'm more afraid that what is coming will actually require me to wear it rather than choosing to. Her words were a bit of surprise to the both of them. She had upgraded her armor from leather, however she wasn't sure how much she would really need for the things to come. Elvish armor should be enough for most modes of battle, but something about this man told her she wasn't about to have an average journey. My skills are enough to keep me alive, or have been so far. I choose to settle things without my blade. If I draw it, I intend to kill something or cut it down to where it will never be a problem again. She didn't like to have to fight without reason, and she very rarely spoke of these things. Suddenly, though, her eyes locked on his blade. They had been walking casually. As she let her eyes settle on the blade, she couldn't help but stop walking again. My blade isn't as thirsty as the one you have. It seems familiar somehow. She could sense a new energy when she looked at the blade. Something about it was drawing her attention more than before, as if something had shifted ever so slightly. It felt ancient, older than the world itself, and it was watching her back. She was certain of it now. Arden had noticed her comment about his sword, but it wasn't too unusual with creatures with any sort of magic. She was of elfish descent, and it was likely she still had some remnants of the power, even though the race had long diminished from its former glory. Peace in a time of war brings no results, Aelynn. It was cold, colder than he intended. Something about her was all too familiar in that moment. The golden flames on her body reminded him of another, but this was something more. You need to be prepared fully. What I'm going to do, where I'm going. If you need to follow, you must be prepared. If you're fast, you'll need to be faster. Strong? Be stronger. This isn't a game. The woman insisted that she'd always sought improvements, but found the world to feel less and less challenging. She began leading him further into the training grounds, deeper into the area towards a quiet corner, past where the women were busy fighting with one another. She told him that she wanted to change the world, but fixing her own land could never be enough. The battle wouldn't even gain enough ground to feel worthy. Her eyes met his. You are going somewhere that might make a difference. How could I resist? She could sense it now. That part of herself that knew things, saw things, became aware of the world in ways she couldn't explain. She hated it. Maybe because it reminded her of the oracles who had betrayed her people long ago. No one will know. No one will see the difference. They may never know your name or that you existed. You could be unwritten from history itself. It was more of a statement about his own life than anything. He'd been erased from the stories that the gods and immortals would share. Even in the short time between his previous death and this body, that he was building back up to the standards which he had for it. Had it not been for the ancient voice driving him forward, the lack of history may have driven him mad as well. It was as if everything he had accomplished was being treated as nothing. Yet, that being said, it was the one role no one else could ever fill. Somehow that was oddly comforting, despite the fact that it seemed that he did not exist to many. What he didn't expect was her next words. She turned towards him and rested her left hand lightly on his arm. They forgot my name long ago. It never stopped me from trying. This voice, she recognized it. It wasn't the girl she was now. It wasn't supposed to step out. Still, this felt like the only time that would fit. There are elder races that never used names, only titles, but they'd been forgotten so long ago. No, why was she recalling this? This was from her childhood, wasn't it? Or was it from before? She hadn't thought about it in so long. Do they need to know the name of a person if what they do changes the tides? Maybe it seems too little. There are titles that will never be forgotten, no matter how buried the gods make them become. She let her eyes settle on the sword now. She knew it, knew him. The blade itself had a name once. They don't need to remember me if I can have the change I want. The world around her was blurring a bit for her. She was aware now. The voice within her was starting to take hold a moment to identify itself, and that had never happened before. What use is a queen on a throne, safe, protected, controlled? What use if her people suffer, if they're better off without? She paused. No, this was actually her own voice again. The pounding in her head wanted nothing more than be satisfied with something to break. She was meant to be the Queen of Astoria, yet if she returned they would use that crown to collar her just like any other slave. To her it was musing in her mind. For him it was something more. He couldn't help but stare at her with a brow raised. This world has little to offer for me. What do you know of all the ancient titles? He didn't expect much. Maybe she found them in one of those lost tomes that was sometimes left about. This world means little compared to what some do. There was a mortal lost a long time ago. Slayer, I remember such a vague story. Something about the stars, the death in the councils. She paused a moment, then shook her head. I was a child. I expect nothing from this world, but I always wanted to make it better somehow. She growled slightly at her own thoughts now. She hated this. Her memories, her visions, things that flickered in and out of existence as if they were fleeting petals torn off by the wind, only to blow back at the strangest moments. Her words had changed something in him. She could see him stiffen. She could feel the conflict, sorrow, rage. It seemed something had taken hold of him as well. He began to name many titles. Generals, kings, gods. But then at the end of naming off the list of them, he finished with, I knew them all, but never heard of that one. Fallen gods aren't worth remembering. Every title he had mentioned, every name, they burned in her blood. She fell silent, continuing to walk more quickly, as if trying to escape her last statement. There are older things worth remembering, but not these damned gods. They treated him like nothing while he hunted them to save his own people. He killed them, saving so many, not just his own kind. He deserved more. She was so angry. She let the words fall off as she walked faster. If anything, she didn't know why. She only knew that they were getting closer to the edge of town. The mortal himself would rather be forgotten, rather this all end. Maybe someday he would be able to consider a normal life, a family, peace. It wasn't meant to last. Her words finally fully hit him. No one should have remembered that man. It was a story he was extremely familiar with, yet with the way she spoke now, he wondered how much she knew. He wanted to question more, but the past wouldn't help him in this next journey. Show me your skills with that blade. If you want to stay by me, as you say, you'll need to live like me. She was almost too excited. A sudden shift in her mood and energy was almost too easy to notice. She wanted new scars, new challenges, new adventures. What he said next, though, had her even more excited. This is like any other battle. Go for the kill. The moment you don't, you underestimate your opponent. If you think I'll take it easy on you, then you're more of a princess than I thought. She held her blade in her right hand to draw it, but then looked over the human with a grin. I'm as much of a princess as my grandmother, but even I know better than to take a disadvantage around someone like you. She gave a half-playful grin, moving her blade back to her left hand. She tried to taunt him, flirting at the idea of staring at each other instead, but she knew that would get her nowhere. Aelynn wanted to fight, bleed, to feel alive for the first time in so long. Her first strike was calculated, slower than she needed to move, and putting her at an angle that she knew would leave her at risk. His response, by pushing her blade away and taking a light tap at her side, only made the woman smile. Yes, he was fast, faster than anyone she was used to fighting. This somehow just made her more bold. She spun back with a better speed, tearing at his shirt, but she wasn't sure she'd actually hit him. For her, it was a game. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to strike at her. He managed to dodge or deflect most of her attacks. There was something so familiar now about his movements. He finally had enough of studying her, though. Once she had a good shot at him, he just pushed her blade away from him with his own. The speed took a swipe into her thigh and towards her stomach. Her own speed was an asset, but she knew that this time it would be impossible to stop. She felt the blade slash into her thigh as her own deflected it, moving it away from the middle of her body as she spun beneath his attack. When most people would have been discouraged, the woman merely grinned. That's right. That's what she wanted. She spun back, turning her body swiftly as she spiraled towards his legs. It was almost as though her own blood fueled her now. The drive to give him a cut or two of his own was keeping her from feeling her injuries. The two hadn't actually fought for long when she felt a sudden change in the air. She could see the giant blade coming down towards her. He picked up quickly on her intentions. Her previous move towards sweeping over him was now far from her mind. She could feel he had no intention at all other than to cut her apart. At this point, all she could do was counter. Her blade flew up to block his strike, which easily would have landed on her shoulder and across her chest. Her blade and her own magic were all there was to save her. The woman drew from a flame within her, forcing light into the blade and across her hand enough to hold back his weapon. He was strong, too strong, and the force of this attack threatened to crush her if she didn't move. Her blade sparked, dripping magical flickers of light from it as she held back his attack to give herself the chance to escape again. The shimmering light was barely enough for most to see. She was only vaguely aware of the use of magic herself. She only intended to survive and strike again. His blade seemed to absorb more of the light to hide her own magic, and she wasn't sure what it meant. It was like it was trying to reach the energy within her. She was already set to push off his blade and step back. That moment never came. Rather, she found herself confused when he suddenly drew back his sword and rested it on his shoulder. He pointed one hand at the sword in her hand. Last I checked, only oracles and royals could use magic like that. She'd forgotten that power was something unusual. That is, until he spoke up. Magic? It still took her a moment. Oracle or royal is fitting, but I'll leave it to your imagination. She stood now, resting her own blade as she looked him over. That blade of yours is different. It's not something anyone would just find. I think that's enough for now. I have a sentiment of what kind of fighter you are. He didn't need to know more. The fact that she'd struck him was enough for the moment. He also wasn't quite ready to show her exactly what he could do with that blade. The man suggested that she not expose too much about herself, nor her magic. He also suggested that she continue to learn how better to use it, as it may come in handy someday. He'd learned quite a lot from their short battle. He also wondered who had taught her, because her style was painfully familiar to him. A part of him wished he hadn't seen it before. He knew the warrior on his mind taught others on occasion before meeting him. He used that thought to dismiss any further questions for now. Aelynn was more playful now. Her wounds were bothering her more than she wished to admit. A bit of banter quickly revealed that her magic was inconsistent at best, activating only when it wishes to. If anything, she was inclined to stay silent about this around anyone else. She felt safe enough around him, but tried to tell herself that it was only because she knew he could kill her and had chosen not to. Her moving closer to him as they walked back made him uneasy. After all, they'd sent many women to try to distract him from his quest. Those who didn't hide their intentions often ended up dead at his hand, if they wouldn't leave on their own. The last one who'd gotten close to him had died in battle next to him. While he knew she wasn't one of theirs, he also wasn't keen on getting close to anyone again. He demanded to know why she was insisting on being close. All she could tell him was, other than that she felt safe, there was something about him that was different than most. It's up to you to decide how close I'm allowed to be. Her words weren't what he expected. No heavy flirting, no demands to be closer. If she had been sent by his enemies, she certainly played the role differently than any other. Later in the evening, after tending her wounds, Aelynn met up with the mortal again. She shared her own story with him. A kidnapped princess told that she was an orphan for a good long time inside of the demon realms. When she mentioned a short time with the Veil Seen, it reminded him of another he once knew. However, the tribes were all women, and most were non-human. The woman had returned to the mortal world seeking her own family. That didn't end so well, and she ended up traveling where the two had met each other. She found the confidence to ask where they were going. When he presented her with what the oracles had told him before, she gave a half smile, but only because it annoyed her. She mentioned the void, a place at the edge of the darkness that may well fit this riddle. Oracles had always been nothing but trouble for her. Even her own abilities were that way. She explained to him that the riddle presented was probably a map. They spoke for quite a while before the tone turned. Eventually, something she said caused a stir within the mortal again. If I sought safety, I wouldn't be here. I will take the freedom, even if it ends suddenly. She paused a moment before speaking for the second time. I can learn where you're going later. For now, I feel I need to follow. He began to tell her a story. A man who had to endure the fury of heaven and hell. A man whose histories were lost to the ages. Of a woman who had everything taken from her, torn away to be alone in the universe, far from anyone and anything, a place where no other could go. But the human began his search, traveling to the furthest reaches of all the realms to find her. Tortured, beaten, broken down, demanding only an answer of where the woman had been taken. His tale followed the route through many of the realms of darkness, and Aelynn found herself lost in how her stomach felt heavy. She suddenly felt faint, her body drained of blood. There was an emptiness and pain she just couldn't explain. The sensation was only for a few moments, yet it haunted her as much as it seemed to haunt him. In her own way of comforting him, she set her hand so lightly on his arm and looked up to him again. They stole something sacred, but maybe it was more than that. The creatures that do these things. Even so, such a human couldn't be kept forever. I wonder what happened after. She paused. When he claimed it was just a story, she actually felt the empty sorrow building into anger. Nothing can be erased from those who were there. She wasn't thinking. The words were coming from a strange part of her mind that held most of her power. The void never forgets what is cast off by creation. The girl had lost control. Whatever was speaking now had taken away her ability to think clearly. It was there, growing within her and demanding to speak. She watched behind ancient glass. They thought they'd blinded her, but it only made her see more. She continued to tell the tale, the parts he had left out, and the parts no one could have known. She was no longer trying to stop herself. If anything, Aelynn had been pulled back from the world. Then something changed. Even the color of her eyes began to shift, softly flowing towards a purple that seemed to flicker slightly as the older parts of herself took hold. He felt the transition. He had already known another energy was here. If anything, it made him cautious and trying to draw it forward more. He growled slightly and demanded that this voice speak. This time, the soul itself spoke to the human. She told him her name was once Nalia, and that she had never forgotten the promise she made. She had never intended to come out on her own, instead hoping for her current self to find out the truth. The woman said that Aelynn was far too curious, though, and had drawn her without intention. Nalia had so much to say to the man, but the time was short, and she did the best she could to cover what was important. She promised him that she would be there to help whenever he needed, as she always was. He knew her. He remembered all of it. Everything about who she had once been. All the parts they'd hidden from their story. He couldn't stop his own feelings for a moment. The aching in his belly and the strange warmth that filled him was a sensation he had not felt in a very long time. He could barely contain the tide of guilt and sorrow, mixed with the burning desire to just speak with and hold her a while longer. Still, he kept all of this held back, behind the cold eyes and half scowl he usually let greet the world. As he began to feel his own control slip, his eyes focused on the blade next to his hand, fully expecting him to reveal it was a trick. After all, the blade would have known. Instead, it rested silently where he had placed it. The gods had used so many tricks. Sending someone to be her, though, was possibly the newest low he could have imagined. Part of him wanted to boil in rage, but in that moment the rage wouldn't come. Rather, he was remembering too much at once, and he had to clear his mind. He was trying to dismiss it, trying to convince himself that none of it was real. Yet somehow he wondered if he hadn't already known. She had always been hidden, keeping herself in shadow, her own power far from what it could have been, all to protect herself and others. After the two caught up a bit on the time and the promises that they had made to each other, the older incarnation told him that the girl would struggle to remember. Aelynn would need to rest. The last words of his previous life's love were not at all what he expected, and ones she would hope he would never forget. You were only moments late and blamed yourself. It was my own visions that betrayed me. I was no longer in my corner, resting wearily in my isolation. They knew you were coming. It was no great consolation to either of them, but she hoped, just a little, that he wouldn't blame himself for the parts that they had refused to tell anyone else. Arden had too much to think about now. While he was aware of the transition back and everything that had been said, he was also aware that there was nothing he could do to help the girl that was in front of him now. He sent her to rest, and she reluctantly agreed. However, she seemed to have parting words for the human as well. Your armor is in the room. The oracle will speak with you soon. She was struggling. She shook her head and closed her eyes. In the end, they did nothing wrong. She wasn't sure what that meant, or what it was related to. Arden had his suspicions, but he refused to believe the words themselves. As he walked to his own room and placed away what was his, he glanced over and inspected his armor. It was well done, but his mind didn't seem to want to focus on that. Of course, it was his fault. In his own mind, he'd failed to do the one thing he'd always promised. He had failed what he believed to be one of his greatest duties. She seemed to want to forgive him, but he wasn't quite sure yet that he could forgive himself. If it was even possible to forgive such a thing. It left him to think, though, was he on the right path? The way that she spoke always left him wondering about himself. He had earned the reputation as the greatest swordsman of his kind. That reputation had faded into the dust so quickly. Already, races like these mocked and belittled his entire people. They didn't want to imagine a mortal who had cleansed their own realms with their people's blood, who had shaken the foundations of their empires and kingdoms. They all wished to forget. His story had been erased, replaced with a title like the ones the gods had feared before him. Arden couldn't continue to think too much on this. He couldn't help either of them if he allowed himself to be distracted from his cause. Whether or not this girl was a genuine incarnation, he couldn't let this shake him. She could fight, but she would need that magic of hers if they intended to go where he wanted to go. As for himself, he felt there was no other choice. He would make them remember him, and he would make them suffer for what they had done. After that, he would end this no matter the cost.